In accordance with the customs of the university, I open the ceremony with a prayer. Spiritus Sancti Gratia illuminat sensus et corda nostra. Please be seated. So welcome at this doctoral graduation ceremony for Mohsen Gavorian. It's a pleasure to see many of you here. I'm the replacement of the rector, and I'm happy to chair this meeting. I would now like to give the floor to the candidate.
With the permission of the Council of the Deans, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled Machine Learning for Quantification of a Small Vessel Disease Imaging Biomarkers. Small vessel disease is defined as a set of pathological processes that negatively affect the normal functioning of the small vessels inside the brain that happens with the aging. As we become older, the small vessels inside the brain become distended and weaker. Besides, a protein called fibrin starts to accumulate inside the vessels that results in narrowing the vessel that would make the normal flow of the blood cells disrupted, and this would in turn result in ischemia, and consequently lesions appear in the brain. 9 out of 10 of us sitting in this room will have some sort of pathological process that is related to small vessel disease in our brain over the age of 60. Small vessel disease is known to be the cause for 40% of occurrences of dementia and 20% of stroke incidences. With a significant increase of the life expectancy in the past few decades and the increase in the population of the elderly, having a proper understanding of small vessel disease and its underlying mechanisms is becoming increasingly important. In order to understand these underlying mechanisms, researchers are interested in studying small vessel disease patient populations, cross-sectionally and also longitudinally track the progression of the disorder over the course of time. However, it is impossible to directly study the pathology of the small vessels themselves because it requires slicing of the patient's brain. Therefore, neurologists instead measure and track the imaging biomarkers that are, of course, much less invasive compared to the former. Here we see a list of small vessel disease imaging biomarkers, and manually annotating and making quantification out of these for medical doctors is a complicated, time-consuming, and subjective task. Therefore, coming up with some automated methods that accurately and objectively make these measurements for us is already a big step forward for better understanding of a small vessel disease. In this thesis, we explore different machine learning algorithms and study different ways to make them most suitable for quantification of some of the small vessel disease, namely the white matter hyperintensity and the lacunes. In chapter 2 of this thesis, we develop machine learning systems for quantification of white matter hyperintensities, formulated and evaluated as a detection rather than a segmentation problem, in order to improve the quality of detection of the smaller lesions. To achieve this, we train an elaborate 2-stage model with separate specialized models trained for separate detection of smaller and larger lesions, and with all of its ingredients optimized for a better detection of smaller lesions. As a result, an FROC analysis that we see here was showing a competitive performance of the trained model, as we see in the blue curve, compared to independent human expert annotators, as we see represented by dots. Chapter 3 and 4 of this thesis is devoted to developing convolutional neural network-based methods for white matter hyperintensity segmentation and exploring different ways for integrating contextual information into them. Integration of contextual information gets a double importance in medical imaging due to the significance of anatomical location information in a correct analysis of imaging features. For instance, for a network to come up with a correct identification of the label of the voxel in the center, it would require to have an imagination where the local neighbor is coming from. Therefore, in order to provide the network with more contextual information, we were considering or letting the network look at the features at different scales, or alternatively, let the network know about the much needed global information about the location and fuse it with a self-extracted local appearance features, as we see here. So as a result, not only we were observing that a CNN-based method was substantially improving over a conventional machine learning-based model, but also we were seeing improvement with integration of multi-scale approach or the multi-scale patches, as well as integrating the explicit location information, and of course both of them at the same time, giving us a human-level performance for the first time in the white matter hyperintensity segmentation task, to the best of our knowledge. In chapter 3, in chapter 4, inspired by the way that our natural visual system behaves in order to perceive and get samples from the world around us, we use a non-uniform patch sampling strategy where we sample more densely from the focal point, and we gradually decrease the sampling rate as we get further from it. So in this way, we get some single representation of the local neighborhood, where we have both the details at the center and also a larger contextual information. And interestingly, a simple single-scale network using this non-uniform patch sampling strategy was outperforming a single-scale method with uniform patch sampling, as well as a much more complicated multi-scale network that was using uniform patch sampling. So in medical imaging, it's actually very costly and time-consuming to come up with new annotated data when we want to train new models for the cases where we are encountering some changes in the scanning protocols or even new tasks. Therefore, in chapter 5, we designed an investigational study in order to learn about the benefits and best practices of transfer learning for domain adaptation applied to white matter hyperintensity segmentation tasks. So doing extensive studies, extensive experiments in our study conducted during my research visit to the surgical planning laboratory at Harvard, involving training and comparing more than 200 different networks, it was revealed that considering or doing proper transfer learning and also leveraging the models that could be trained on legacy data could significantly and substantially improve the performance and also give us models that require much less training data on the target set. So for example, here we see that a model that was doing transfer learning and leveraging the model trained on the legacy data, using only 2 annotated cases on the target domain is performing on par compared to a model that is training from scratch but is using 50 cases. Chapter 6 is devoted for developing and proposing some 2-stage 3D convolutional neural network for detection of lacunes. And here we designed a 2-stage model where in the first stage we use fully convolutional networks for doing candidate detection and then doing a more elaborate second stage false positive reduction using 3D convolutional networks. FROC analysis over the result and making comparison against 4 independent readers, as we can see here in these 4 FROC curves, show that the resulting model is performing very competitive compared to the independent readers on a test set of 111 cases. Also, a following feasibility study showed that once the suggestions of a CAD system is shown to a weak reader, then it would significantly increase the sensitivity, and it doesn't harm hardly. It doesn't harm too much for the specificity. To summarize, in this thesis, we developed and proposed several methods for detection and segmentation of white matter hyperintensities, as well as detection of lacunes. We proposed and compared different methods for integrating contextual information into CNNs that is much needed for the medical imaging tasks. Also, we extensively studied the behavior, benefits, and best practices of transfer learning for domain adaptation applied to white matter hyperintensity segmentation tasks. And I'm particularly happy that some of the methods that we have developed are being used in real clinical studies done by the neurology department and has led and are still leading to some high-impact publications. And most importantly, I hope it would be a small step toward a better understanding of this disorder and the underlying mechanisms. Having presented this summary of my doctoral thesis, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much. So we will now start the opposition, and for that I would first like to give the word to the chair of the manuscript committee, Professor Norris.
Yes, thanks very much. And before I start, I'd also like to compliment you and your supervisors on a very interesting and in some ways challenging thesis. If I look through the thesis, I see in some chapters that your algorithms are getting close to human performance. In some chapters, I see a wide variation in human performance. I was wondering, if you had a child, would you advise them to train as a radiologist?
Honored, sir, and thanks for your compliment. Yeah, indeed, that's a very challenging question to answer. And so also this question is becoming sort of very well thought out at the moment, that will these computer-aided system or in general intelligent system replace human beings or like medical expert in particular in this field? And my short answer for that would be yes, but not for any time in the close future. And the reason I think it will replace at some point is because I think whatever that our natural neural networks can do can also be simulated via computation. So at the end, it's some firings of the neurons that are happening back there. So we can have those simulated. However, at the moment, we have a lower capacity compared to the brain, and also some maybe less efficient representations. And also the economy will move us toward that. That's also important. However, I don't think it will happen in any time in the close future, maybe not even for a child. And the reason for that is, at the moment, all the hype and the great results are on just doing the perception on the images. And neurologists and like radiologists do much more than that. Beside that, it's very important to have a liability. So if you look at it from the perspective of a patient, it takes a long time in order to have the whole society convinced to move toward there, because they want to have someone that interact with them or are actually reliable to what happens there.
Okay, I think that's probably reassuring for a lot of people. Dear candidate, I'd like to ask you also a more detailed question. Actually, it concerns one of the figures that you showed during your presentation. That's 5.2 on page 73. And I was particularly drawn to this because we often have a situation where there are longitudinal studies and we change the equipment and leave the poor person running the study powerless to do anything about it. And then, of course, it's an important question to what extent you can transfer your algorithms across different experimental conditions. And what kind of surprised me in 5.2 is the fact that the one layer fine-tuning is performing better than the 9 and the 15 layer fine-tuning. I'm not an expert in this area, but could you perhaps explain to me why you think this is happening and what would happen if you maybe went to some intermediate numbers like 2 or 3?
Yeah. So actually, I think the main reason that this is happening is the size of the training data that is available. So actually, your neural networks are consisting of like millions of parameters to be learned. Mm-hmm. And in the cases where, like for example, in the number that you mentioned, for example, when we have only 2 cases available that is annotated on the target set, mm-hmm. then I would say that perhaps the amount of data there is not enough for fine-tuning a larger number of layers, and therefore it is prone for overfitting. And that's, I think, the way we can explain it.
So, but you didn't try any intermediate numbers because of the computational...
So actually, if you look at the table, the figure represented in figure, I mean, the figure B, mm-hmm. what we see there, I mean, the extensive experimentation is also there. So for example, for 2 cases, if you look at the first column, yeah. So for any number of layers being fine-tuned, we also have measured the performance. Yeah. And only represented a few for a matter of readability in the figure A.
Yeah. So, but 1 is the best in this situation.
Yeah. So as we look at this spectrum, so as we decrease the layer, or actually as we increase the layer, the performance becomes a bit worse, perhaps, for the overfitting problem.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You can if you want.
Well, I was going to ask you actually about chapter 6, because you move into the area for lacunes, But given the large variability in the performance of the observers, you don't really seem to have a gold standard, do you? Isn't the gold standard very important for this approach?
That's absolutely true. So that was one of the challenges we were facing, how to make a proper ground truth, and that was why we actually conducted this study with 4 readers involved, because we were doing majority voting to make the ground truth more reliable. And I think that could also at the same time be a very good motivation in order to use these kind of objective automated methods. That, I mean, seeing that these trained readers are already so variant, then maybe having something that does exactly the same way, even if it is a bit biased over the longitudinal studies, that would be perhaps something useful.
But isn't this tending to a very conservative estimate? I mean, the numbers were so large, the range was so large, you really wondered, indeed, if you were close to a ground truth, that there were really fundamental differences in the way they were approaching the data. I mean, there was almost a factor of 4, I think, or a factor of 3 in terms.
Yeah, you mean in the number of
in
documents?
The number
yeah, actually, one of the readers were really conservative in detecting something. Yeah, and it might be the case that maybe the analysis is being properly done, but the threshold is being put somewhere differently. And yeah, I mean, this is actually a drawback that is there, and we were also concerning this. But yeah, I mean, we hope that including more experts informing the ground truth that we're using actually 3 any time that we're comparing something against the other reader, we're excluding that one, and forming the majority vote, and hoping that that would decrease these kind of variabilities and increase the quality of the ground truth.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Then I would like to give the word to Dr. De Bruyne from Erasmus MC in Rotterdam.
Dear candidate, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you and also your supervisors with completing this very nice thesis. And it's great to see that some of the techniques you developed are actually already in use in clinical studies. So I'd like to discuss with you the two-stage approaches that you use in chapters 2 and 6. And of course, I'm wondering here, are these 2 stages really necessary, and wouldn't it be much easier and perhaps more efficient to train a single model? So let's start with chapter 2. So then on page 33, I think figure 2.9, I guess that is your... So here I see some evidence that the 2-stage model is better than the single-stage model. But if I understood you correctly, they are not trained on exactly the same data, is that right?
Yes.
And the 2-stage model has seen more data, actually, or in total over its 2 stages than the single-stage model.
So, yeah, that maybe needs some more explanation. So first of all, let me thank you for the compliment. And so actually, here in this specific case, so indeed the single-stage model is seeing more data compared to any of the 2-stage models, because one policy that we thought would be better was to separate the data for training the first stage and the second stage model. So for example, the first stage model is seeing like 1/3 of the data and 2/3 for the second stage. However, the single-stage model sees all of them at the same time. So I would say it's even an advantage for it. But we still see that it's performing worse, and maybe we can discuss why this is happening, or at least my understanding or explanation about that. So I think here, because we are doing a FRC analysis, it's quite important to do a correct detection for the smaller lesion, and I think this separation was something we did in favor of that, because if we consider the single-stage model, so the way that we do the sampling might be affected by having these different strategies, and maybe even more importantly, the intermediate representations that a 2-stage model gets in the second stage is kind of very loosely simulating what's happening in deep learning. So we learn some higher level representations that go into the next stage, the next layers that want to look at them and make some higher level decisions based on that. And the 2-stage has this, and this way perhaps the detection of the smaller lesions could be improved compared to not having those representations.
Okay, so it wasn't quite clear to me from the text, but the comparison is fair or perhaps even biased towards, biased in favor of the other model. Okay. And then my next question is, so here you see that the two stages, that it actually works for the reasons possibly that you state. In the rest of your white matter lesion detection, you move to a single stage again, and we no longer check for small and large lesions separately. So why is that no longer needed, or would it have been needed?
So yeah, that's a good question. So indeed, the main reason that we didn't continue doing that was because we wanted to keep the evaluation part simple. So if you look at the thesis, the location, I think in chapter, in section 2.4, it's like a very brief and summarized version of the evaluation, the FRC, and it is still one page of explanation how we are evaluating. And we thought it might be a bit difficult to continue with that because it's hard to understand. And in general, you know, because of the very heterogeneous forms that these white matter lesions can get, it's very difficult to come up with the right form. So because in the next chapters we wanted to evaluate the contributions of the other methodological parts, like integration of contextual information, etc., we wanted to keep the evaluation part as simple as possible. Also, have it remain like kind of comparable to the other studies, because if you look at the white matter hyperintensity segmentation field at the moment, dye similarity is the overwhelming metric, and we wanted to keep our method comparable to the others.
Okay, so now you can very well compare to results by others, but not really to your own previous results anymore.
That's to some extent actually done. So if you look at the figure in chapter 3, which is, for example, the ROC curve or the tables that represent the dye, so it's figure 3.4a.
Yeah.
So we also have the conventional CAD system. Actually, it's not exactly the same as represented in the second chapter, and the main reason was there we were not optimizing for segmentation rather than we were optimizing for detection. Therefore, this was a segmentation optimized version of that using the same methods, and we were outperforming it with deep learning.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think in the interest of time, I will not ask further about the rest of the two-stage approaches, but move to my other question. Throughout your thesis, you argue that including context is very important, and you show some clear evidence for that. The context that you've investigated is mostly on the input side, and I could imagine that context on the output side could also be relevant. If we want to know the decision for a certain voxel, it would help to know what the voxels surrounding it are doing. So do you think such information would be important to incorporate, and how would you do that?
So to make it completely clear for myself, so we are referring to have the predictions made for the neighboring voxels rather than just the raw representation over the images. Is that what you mean? To do some sort of smoothing or higher level consistency check? Or?
Something like that. There are
so
many ways of doing that.
Yes, definitely that's a very promising direction. And I think, yeah, previously people were doing conditional random fields, Markov random fields, and different kind of way to form some sort of homogeneity in the segmentation or smoothness. And very recently, these generative adversarial models can also be used in order to make sure that higher level consistencies would be preserved. And I think those could have been very interesting, but unfortunately we didn't look at those within the scope of our thesis.
Do you think there's still room for improvement in your current results? So would you need that kind of context?
So regarding what we are getting, it's becoming a bit more complicated to imagine if we get further improved from where we are, for example, for chapter 3 and 4, because we are almost there at the inter-rater variability level. Mm-hmm. And whatever higher we get, maybe it could be sort of overfitting to the patterns that one of the readers has. So I think it's a bit difficult to see if these current work in these specific applications would improve. But definitely these kind of stuff on other challenging kind of problems could be very useful.
Okay, I'm satisfied with your answers and would like to give the word back to the rector.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to give the floor to Professor Tahar Romani from the Technical University Eindhoven.
Dear candidates, it's a pleasure to have an interaction with you. I want to congratulate you with this very readable, very nice thesis, also your promotores and co-promoter. It is the first question. I'm a physicist, not a physician, and I want to hear a little bit of physiological explanation. If I look on page 34 to the image 2.10, I see that the annotations have always been at very specific locations in the brain. And if I look at page 24, you make some density of where are the white matter hyperintensities, where are they found? And it's always next to the ventricles. What might be the reason to be just there?
Honored sir, and thanks for the compliment. So to make sure I understood the question correctly, so you are referring that why does it happen that lesions appear
Well,
mostly...
I want to go to context. The previous opponent was, if you talk about context, you want to also know what is the specific location. Is it next to some area that contains water? Is it maybe an area that is very active in energy use or whatever? I mean, what might be the reason that the localization of all the things that you want to detect, why are they located at specific locations?
So I think there should be some kind of biological reason for this, and perhaps because this is a disorder of the small vessels in the brain, it might be that maybe the concentrations of the small vessels are more there, or different kind of proteins that could play a role in this. For example, the fibrin that I was referring to in my presentation might be more active in that place. However, going into more details on this specific is unfortunately out of the scope of my knowledge. So
I understand you didn't investigate it, but I thought you have been 4 years in this field, that maybe your colleagues might have told you more about that. I want to go a little bit to the figure 2.1 on this page 34. If I look at this, the two rows to the right and then the figures in the middle, there are quite some differences in annotations. If I look at the third row, the middle image, you see left of the center line some detection, and to the same image to the right, there is no detection at all. And it seems to me, I'm not an expert, that the detection is relatively almost obvious. What have been the instructions to the readers? Did they communicate before?
Yes, yes. That's absolutely the case. So I think it also has been mentioned, but so these annotations I think were done around 2006-07. But as far as I know, so there were two readers. They were first coming up with agreement about the definition of white matter hyperintensities, and then manually doing annotations, I think for 50 cases independently, and then discussing the results, and then doing all of the cases over again. And I think the main reason for the subjectivity is like the very elaborate nature of this, because it's really time consuming and the readers need to do many cases. So it might be that some of those become overlooked for the interest of time, perhaps.
I see. Thank you very much. My next question will be about your foveated model. My own field is brain-inspired computing, as you know, and it's really interesting to see how you use this fovea. On page 60, you describe it, and you give also a nice figure. But first of all, you say the mapping is exponential, and you give a formula in formula 4.2. And if I look at the many measurements that people have done in many species, it is linear from the fovea. If you look at the receptive field size, and current models also look at that it might be related to, for example, ego motion detection. If I move my hand to my face, then how is the velocity field? That's a linear eccentricity relation. So that's a pretty robust model. Why did you choose an exponential model?
Yes, so indeed the main reason that we chose the exponential model was to be able to fit more contextual information and be able to go farther away. So if you use a linear kind of sampling, then it might resemble more to the natural visual system that we have. However, we want to have the details at the center, because there is a structure that we want to classify, and at the same time we want to be able to see further away from that. So with a linear one, we should either stick to a very small area and have the detail at the center, or just sacrifice the detail at the center and go further away. And with the exponential kind of formulation that we are making, we can have both at the same time.
But with linear, it increases, and you have on the sides much more coarser sampling, so that's exactly the same.
So if I understand that correctly, I think with exponential kind of grow, we more quickly go farther away and get samples from farther locations.
That's true. If I look at your figure 4.2a, then you have some samples that are in the corner of the square that are really far away. But to take a square is in a computer very handy, but in physiology and in modeling it is just terrible, because you have very nasty things. You have some points that are very far away. Why didn't you take a circle? Yeah, you get all kind of artifacts now, and it is actually kind of laziness, because the computer is doing it then easier.
So I completely agree with you that this property that we get this kind of Gaussian-like structure that goes much farther away on the corner is kind of an artifact and something we might not necessarily want to have. And I think this is something that comes with the formulation of this distance. For example, the one we were discussing about, that we exponentially grow the distance, because those are on the patch also farther away compared to the ones that are just vertically above it. We also exponentially increase it more and go farther away. I think it could have been a very good idea also to try it something like a circular structure. And I think if we wanted to do that and still stick to this exponential growth, we should have changed our definition of distance inside the patch. So at the moment we are using the Euclidean distance. If we were using a distance defined as maximum of a distance over x and y, then the distance at the corner of the patch that we wanted to find the corresponding location in the image could also have the same distance compared to a sample in the patch just above it, and then it would have formed a circular structure, as you mentioned. And I fully agree that that could have been a...
Or something in between, hexagonal or whatever. Is it time for a note? Okay, then thank you very much. I'm happy with the answers.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Tulada from our own university and hospital.
Dear candidates, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you with this wonderful thesis, and I'd like to congratulate you also with your supervisors. With great interest, I've read your thesis, and you showed in a wonderful way that you could segment the small vessel brain related lesions with white matter, such as white matter lesions and lacunar infarcts. And you use that using machine learning. And as you know, and as you showed in your presentation, that these lesions are related to the clinical symptoms. So segmentation of these lesions are quite essential in our work. One of the reasons why you find these lesions in certain regions is due to the vascular small vessels. So they're related, normally they're seen at the end of the small vessels that have less collaterals. My first question will be about the DICE score. So you use the DICE score to measure how well your segmentation is related to reference segmentation. So the DICE score is related to this reference segmentation, which is then used as a gold standard. So my first question is, how did you calculate the DICE score, and how high should the value be to have a good score?
Honored, sir, and thank you for the compliments. So the computation of the DICE score is 2 times the intersection of the reference segmentation and the ground truth divided by the sum of the absolute values. I mean, the sum of the size of the segmentation plus the ground truth. And so regarding a good value for that, it could be a bit subjective from task to task. However, in a review paper I was reading that some of the authors were suggesting some values for dice to score larger than 0.7 is considered as a decent segmentation. And some other evidence we can use for coming up with such an idea is the inter-rater variability. Of course, it pretty much depends how severe the lesions are, how many small lesions are there. But for example, in this study, we found that the inter-rater variability was around 0.8. So anything close to that, I would say, would be some satisfactory results.
Okay. The dice score also relates to how well you can segmentate. So if there's a region that you can segmentate quite well, then you would expect to have a higher dice score than for regions that are less that can be segmented. And in the thesis, you also saw the dice score between two observers is around 0.8. So it's not 100%. So there are regions that can be segmented differently between two observers. So you don't have a real good reference. So there's no real good ground truth of the manual segmentation of, in this case, white matter lesions. So what do you think could be the reasons that you don't get 100%? And the second question will be, is there another way to get a better reference segmentation of ground truth?
Regarding your question for 100%, you mean the agreement between the method and the ground truth? I mean, to make a very perfect method, or the inter-rater variability to be?
The inter-rater variability, yeah.
So I think, so perhaps having more elaborate and more extensive kind of discussions before doing, and just making sure that all of the definitions are just the same among the raters would be something that could be helpful. And also not putting pressure of time for the raters to do their job, I think would be something that might improve the inter-rater variability. However, I wouldn't expect 100% because after all, we are all humans and we do mistakes. So I would expect that we can increase it to some degree, to a larger number with some policies as we discussed, but maybe the 100% for such a elaborate task that, I mean, we have like thousands of voxels or 100,000 of voxels to be annotated within a brain, and so having 100% overlap would be almost impossible.
So what would be your solution to get a ground truth?
Yeah, so I think some other direction that we can take in order to provide better ground truths now that with these improvements in machine learning we are getting close and we need a better ground truth is to perhaps include more readers. So we know that like doing voting or averaging over the opinions of readers would already improve the performance. So if instead of 2 we have 5, 10 or even more readers involved in the annotation process and use the majority of them to form the ground truth, definitely that would be helpful.
Do you think you need to have a human observer to get a ground truth?
So that depends. So yeah, I mean, it depends on the definition of the ground truth. So we already know that humans also do make mistakes. And at the moment, the definition of ground truth is something that comes from human experts. However, if we can prove later on that computer models can do this maybe more accurately, maybe in the near future we can form some ground truths or some reference standards given the segmentations made by automated systems.
Okay.
A very short one.
A very short question. First of all, so you have this front page, which is quite good, nice. This is your own brain, I presume, and you colored it with different colors. Is there a reason why you colored different with different colors, and not just black and white for like white matter hyperintense segmentations?
So actually, this is a kind of cool deep learning application called the deep style transfer, that you provide 2 images, and then it applies the style of one image to the other one. So I didn't choose myself all of the pixels colors, but I just picked a beautiful painting with nice colors, and then it was automatically applied to
So what I just wanted to say is, so you segment that into yes and no lesions. The question is whether you have to segment, dichomatize between yes or no lesions, or is there intermediate voxels that are looks normal but might be not normal as per se.
Yes, so you mean some sort of fuzzy assignment
Yeah.
of the lesion. That's very actually interesting, and we were trying to, we were spending time to develop methods for detecting, for example, for this specific case, dirty white matter or the diffusely abnormal white matter. I think that would be very useful in clinical practice, and they might have quite importance.
Okay.
But yeah, it needs some more time.
I'm happy with your answers.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to give the floor to Professor van Ginneken.
We're both pressing the buttons. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and dear candidate. I congratulate you with a beautiful thesis. And I would like to ask you some questions about things you write in your general discussion on page 102 at the end. There you talk about future perspectives, and you say it will be very interesting to do a patient-level analysis. And I really agree, and I think you make very good points there. Unfortunately, at the end of the paragraph, you say, yeah, we don't have enough data, so we can't do it. And that might be true, that statement, but still I would like to hear from you how you would proceed with that and how you can do a patient-level analysis, because I think that would be very interesting.
Honored, sir, and thank you for the compliment. So I fully agree that this is a very important point and something that we are actually lacking at the moment in the medical imaging, that the data sets that we have access to are not large enough for doing studies. Of course, in the computer visions, there are fields that try to take some approaches like a few-shot learning, these kind of stuff, that can be used maybe over there. However, we cannot also expect it to do magic. Without enough amount of data giving us enough variation or information over the distribution of the data, we cannot really do too much. I think maybe the best direction would be to change the atmosphere in the field. So I pity that a bit, that in contrast to the general computer vision, where there are like gigantic data sets available and people are very willing to share.
But can't you're a clever computer scientist, right? So can't you eke something out of the data, even though it's a small data set? And you say the tools are used in clinical studies. They have the same amount of data, right? And they are trying to approach patient-level questions, I suppose. So isn't there something you can do with the small size of data you have?
Maybe yes. Maybe with the same techniques that I was mentioning, the few-shot learning, we can do something. But as I said, because the very small size, when we are doing segmentation, the units of samples are voxels, so we have millions of them for a single patient. But to do a patient-level kind of machine learning, just having 10 samples included, I think that wouldn't give us a good... we can have some models that can do well on the training, but I would be afraid that it wouldn't generalize well to an unknown test set.
Yeah, okay, so you basically say, no, I can't do anything with this small amount of data, but you also said to the previous speakers, yeah, we need more human readers to annotate the data. Yeah, you apparently need a lot more resources. But if you would get a lot of money, would you invest it in scanning more patients or hiring more human graders to annotate the lesions much more carefully?
So you mean to go in direction of supervised learning or semi-supervised learning, to have more scan data without labels, right?
We just give you a lot of money, a lot of budget to actually solve the problem here. What would you spend it on?
Yeah, if I want to work on a patient-level problem, like doing these kind of predictions that we were discussing there at that location of thesis, I think I would go for scanning, having more data, more amount of data, for more scans, that we have the corresponding labels for them. For this patient level, that would be absolutely necessary.
Okay, and not more readers. I thank you for your answer, and I give the floor back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. Then the next one in line is Professor De Leeuw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear candidate, I would also like to congratulate you with this beautiful thesis, and I'd like to extend my congratulations to your entire supervision team. I think it's an impressive thesis that I think it has everything in it to become a landmark thesis that really is a game changer in clinical radiology as we know it today. I would like to discuss with you about your general discussion, and more particularly on page 101, where it becomes, in first instance, a little bit philosophical. You say, well, these image analysis machines are being inspired by biology, which had the time for billions of years to become so complex that they can learn from these from biology. And I was wondering, so could this also be a limitation in your approach, in a way that your algorithm, so your computer-assisted algorithm, can never become smarter or faster than the teacher, so to say, than the biological system, so to say?
Honored, sir, and thanks for the nice compliment. I don't think that's necessarily an upper bound for us when we are using models that, for example, have the same model of information processing as a brain, or even the ground truth that is provided by the human. Because, for example, if you consider the computational time and the speed of making these inferences, even though it might loosely be inspired by the computational model of the brain, but I think we can go further. We can go beyond that in speed and also in accuracy. Because, you know...
So what's really needed for that? So, and perhaps if you make a comparison to biology, is it faster? Do you need to have more connections? Do you have bigger computers, bigger brains, so to say? What are the key to further development, so to say?
So actually, at the moment, it is known that the computational capacity of the supercomputers that we have is smaller than the capacity of the brain, or actually a human brain, better to say. So I think we still need to have some time to have computers that can reach. So if we continue with the same slope that we are proving, I think in a few decades we will be there to have the same computational capacity, and I think that's absolutely important. And another thing that we also have to take into account that our brain is actually a multi kind of functioning organ. So we are not just neurologists or someone that is specified to do something, but our brain is optimized to do many different tasks. And I think having some kind of computational resources and models that are devoted to doing specifically something and optimized for that would be some evidence that they can go beyond humans.
So as I understand from you, so far we don't have these systems yet. So what are next steps to be taken to develop these multi-parallel systems, so to say?
So you mean the directions to have better hardware that does this?
Well, you again compare with the brain. You say, well, there are many processes going into parallel. You're an MR physicist, but you're also doing many other tasks during the day. So many parallel functions. And you say, well, that could be of use also to implement it in computer systems. But how?
Yeah.
If I understand you correctly.
Yeah. So actually, this parallelism is currently being used in GPUs. So we have many cores that can do independent computations at the same time. And we just need to maybe have better transistors that can do more computation over time and more amount of memory available, these kind of stuff to be able to have the same computational power as a brain.
Okay. And would that also, go to the next issue, ultimately solve the problem of gold standard, as we would call that as clinicians, and you as an MR physicist perhaps would call that as the ground truth? That because if you also, again, reason from biology, you would say, well, it could be a limitation for biological systems to, or perhaps you should get rid of these biological systems to ultimately reach ground truth and perhaps develop better computer systems to better segment and identify lesions. Is that a way to move forward and improve the field of these computer-aided detections?
So sorry, can you repeat the question again?
So now you say in order to prevent from misclassification, we use human raters, and you also argued before that we need more human raters in order to get a better gold standard or ground truth. But again, there is this perhaps internal limitation because it's still biological systems. So do we improve the process by adding more biological systems, or should we take a next step
Yeah, so I think the next step is pretty much dependent on having that verified that is over the performance of a human expert. And I think at the moment we are at the time that our system are actually becoming on par to the human performance. And we need to have ways in order to prove that they go beyond. For example, in the studies that I was doing, I had no way to prove this.
And if I may interrupt, that's interesting because how do you do that? How can you ultimately prove that a computer is doing better than a human?
Yes.
Does the computer have to go back to the human and ask, well, what do you think of it, or how do you
So
view
I think
that?
there are different ways to do that. One of them is, of course, include several raters that, several raters,
Several.
readers that using the consensus over them would definitely result in some ground truths that has a better quality. And then if we show a better agreement with that consensus ground truths, more than all of the other readers, we are already showing that it's become better. However, based on the assumption that the consensus is becoming better than every of the single ones. And there are other ways. So, for example, there have been other studies that there are different ways to know whether a diagnosis is correct or not. For example, in histopathology, we have the histochemistry that, for example, can tell you with more costs involved, they can tell you with a better accuracy compared to imaging that what is a real diagnosis. So in that case, it has been, for example, easy to prove that a computer system can actually overpass the performance of the human expert. This could be some other direction. However, that is not maybe directly possible in the specific applications that we have been talking, for example, for white matter hyperintensity task, because there is no other alternative way to compute them more accurately.
Okay. Thank you for your answers, and give the microphone back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Dr. Taewin. The floor is yours.
Dear candidate, congratulations with your thesis and your many well-thought-of experiments. My first question is on Chapter 4, which is your non-uniform patch sampling for white matter hyperintensity segmentations. And what you show in Figure 4 is that your non-uniform sampling performs at least as good as the uniform multiscale approach. And in your initial presentation, you mentioned that the multiscale approach is much more complex. But then again, if you want to apply a model like this in practice, you wouldn't apply it to your single patch, you would apply it to the complete brain. And as far as I understand, a multiscale network you can apply in a fully convolutional way. So you can change the network slightly and just feed it the whole image. So how would you do that with your non-uniform sampled patches?
Honored, sir, and thanks for the compliment. To give a short answer regarding your final question, it is not possible to apply fully convolutional network for a non-uniform patch sampling in the current formulation that we are having. There are different ways to do that. So for example, this non-uniform patch sampling can kind of be simulated with dilated convolutions. There we can do fully convolutional network. And also, I would say that maybe these non-uniform patch sampling strategies, if we really care about a very high computational efficiency for example, as in segmentation tasks, maybe we should apply it for kind of classification tasks, as we had, for example, in Chapter 6 for lacune detection. We had a second stage classifier that looks at the candidates that are already filtered considerably. So you have a number of candidates, and you don't want to apply it in a fully convolutional way, and you can apply it to get more contextual information.
Of course you can do that, but do you still then think this model is less complex than the multiscale approach?
In the segmentation task, computationally not, but there also for the complexity, I wasn't exactly or completely referring to the computational time, but the amount of, or the degree of freedom that a model has. So just consider that you have 3 scales as I had in that chapter. How do you want to apply? Do you want to apply the streams for extracting features from this independently or merge them together? How do you want to come to a unique solution? There is a lot of degree of freedom that makes a procedure complicated, and it also increases the amount of hyperparameters that we have. In that sense, it is more complicated.
Okay, then for my second question, I would like to go to chapter 5, which is your deep transfer learning for white matter hyperintensity segmentation. What you do there in your experiments is you take your neural network and you freeze some initial layers and you fine-tune the others. So my first question related to this is, why would you do this? Well, you actually already mentioned it briefly in the first paragraph on page 70, that the initial filters learn edges, corners, and simple blob-like structures. So I would assume, you would assume that the global appearance would already be captured in that in those layers. But would you expect that you could also retrain your initial layers to get a similar performance, or?
Yes, that's actually an interesting alternative approach to if you refer to that, to freeze the final layers and fine-tune the shallowest ones, because with the domain adaptation, specifically in this task, the target concept, which is white matter hyperintensity, is the same. However, the low-level appearances of the features change, and that motivates what you said. However, I would still prefer to use the one that I suggested. And the reason I would say that is because, so first of all, if we stick to the conventional way to interpret these neural networks, so in the first layer, as you mentioned, we have this corner detection, blob detection, and with a different appearance in the raw input image that goes into the network, still the same edges or corners in different orientations would be useful. However, the distribution of the responses is the thing that is being changed. And as an input to the consequent layer, to subsequent layers, those are the layers that get a different input and might want to have been changed. And something else also to mention here. So if you freeze the final part of a network, you are pretty much fixing the final decision-making part. And then by fine-tuning this, we are hoping that we can create the same representations.
Let me briefly interrupt. You could, of course, only freeze the final convolutional layers, which learn the filters, not the prediction layers.
So sorry, you said.
So you could split it in three parts. So you would have your convolutional part, which you split in a frozen and a non-frozen part, and then you could have the dense layers, which you either.
Okay, so you want to also fine-tune the dense parts, so the final decision-making part would be flexible. Yeah, that might be doable, but I think it's already making the method more complicated. So we have now two hyperparameters to decide where to cut on the right hand and where to cut on the left hand. So I would think that still sticking to a simpler one, assuming that those low-level representations are still useful but result in a different distribution of the responses, as we are also seeing in the empirical results, would be useful. But yeah, definitely those are directions we can go for.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis, but one thing I was wondering is that, okay, we do notice in practice that the first couple of layers learn more like edge-like features and so on. But if you're trying to classify an object, you could as well just start looking at the details and then going up and up. So why do you think that the neural network learns it in this way and not the other way around, or is it possible?
So what you mean is to have a neural network that captures high-level structures in the shallowest layers, and then as it goes deeper. I think there are two problems with this. First of all, this is not an efficient way to learn the representations, because actually by having building blocks in the first layers and using those and combining those in order to learn more complicated features, it is actually much more efficient in terms of number of parameters. And second of all, I'm afraid that wouldn't be possible. Maybe I should have said it first. Because if you consider the receptive field of a network, as we go deeper into the network, a receptive field starts to increase. And this is inevitable. We cannot do anything for it. And then you would expect that you have some high-level structures that are being detected in a very small receptive field. And as you go to a larger receptive field, they start to represent very basic building blocks. So I think that might be very difficult to imagine.
I'm satisfied with the answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Then looking back to the person that I had to got a bit short. I was wondering whether Professor Tahar Romani perhaps still has a question to ask.
To ask you some more questions, that is, you have wonderful data sets, 362, but they are from 2006, with a 1.5 Tesla scanner. And you also have another data set, a much more modern data set, much more modern, more or less modern, with a 3 Tesla data set. And we talked a lot about context. What might be the contextual differences between these field strengths? Would you see more with 3 Tesla in small detail, better signal-to-noise ratio? What?
I think that would be the case. So I think with the higher magnetic field, with a larger one like with a 3 Tesla, the machine would be able to better decrease the resolution and then have less problem with the partial volume effect. That's what I would expect.
I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my doctoral thesis to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisors, as well as all of those who honored this ceremony with their presence.
The doctoral examination board now retreats for its deliberations. The Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen has decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Professor Karsemeyer to discharge the task assigned to him.
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Council of Deans, I hereby confer upon you, Mohsen Gaforian, born in Tehran, the title of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As a proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisors and co-supervisors.
Please be seated. I would like to give the word to Dr. Platel, Mohsen's main supervisor.
Thank you. Zeer geleerde Dr. Gaforian, dear Mohsen, I'm very proud. It was a very good defense. And it means a lot to me to be able to stand here and to be the first one to address you, the young doctor. And I've been looking forward to this moment since we hired you, and even more after what happened to me last year. At first I had the feeling that the past 4 years had passed in the blink of an eye, but then to prepare this speech, I reread the emails that we exchanged before you came here in July 2013. You write as a notably polite Iranian looking for a research position in the Netherlands, and me writing as a postdoc looking for a promising PhD student. Rereading those initial emails made me feel as if they were written in a previous lifetime. Also, an enormous shift happened in the medical image analysis field during kind of like the first year when you were working in the group. And if you read now chapter 2, classical machine learning, that changed when Bram Vrinneke motivated us to move to deep learning, something new. And as one of the very early adopters, you embrace this new methodology, and that's now the method of choice in the whole community. As a result, chapter 2 of your thesis reads like an ancient text containing obsolete knowledge. 4 years can seemingly pass in the blink of an eye, but not in this case. More than a lifetime of bad things happened during the last 4 years. Among the worst things that happened is that your submitted papers were rejected countless times based on nonsense remarks and utterly stupid editors and reviewers. One reviewer even rejected the submission because he found the problem unimportant. As we reported that even the worst patient with small vessel disease had only 82 milliliters of white matter hyperintensities, which after an infantile and erroneous equation led him to believe were only 14 voxels on MRI scan. I'm sure that when people describe you, they say, oh, he's super polite. And every time that I had to read a draft rebuttal of you, I was surprised. No matter how ludicrous the reviews were, they were always super polite, super friendly, very good, well written. That was every time, except this one time when you had to reply to this reviewer. Your remark in this reviewer to this ignorant reviewer was the rudest statement that I read from you in all the years that you worked together. Frustrated at countless rejections, major revisions, and even after months of work, subsequent rejections, Mosen wrote the following. It is surprising that a reviewer of TMI does not note that a milliliter equals 1,000 cubic millimeter, and simply concludes that a report does not make sense. I guess you have to know Mosen to understand that for his doing, that's very rude. Terrible reviews aside, health-wise and 40 things happened to me during the last year that I was your supervisor. Shortly after you started working here, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And over the years, this forced me to reduce the work I was doing. And I had to focus my research and to drop a lot of the work that I was doing. And because of the number of PhD students that I was able to supervise dwindled to a single one. When I had to reduce my research, I chose to drop most of what I was working on, except for the new research that we were doing together. I enjoyed working on this topic the most, and to be able to work together with you made that a very simple choice. You have shown to have considerable talent. You understand complex machine learning material, and you can make others grasp it as well. You explain your work to everybody, whether they are experienced computer scientists, clinicians, or students. Examples of these are your clear lectures during the deep learning workshop in our research group, your in-depth presentations at the computer science departments, and your not so in-depth but very understandable lectures at the neurology department. And of course your valued contributions to teaching as well in the computer science faculty. Perhaps even more importantly, you have shown that apart from these talents you possess even greater skills. You're friendly, polite to a fault, and you patiently listen to what others have to say. You're open to new ideas, discuss challenges, and selflessly help others. Some days my MS made me slow, and sometimes my speaking was slurred and my thinking was clouded. On these days I felt inadequate as a supervisor, but you never made me hesitate to ask you for an explanation. And you always took time to discuss our ideas. And I left every meeting with a great feeling, the sense that I did contribute and that I was heard and that my opinion was valued. I immensely enjoyed your and your partner Babak's visit to my house and the hospital, and our kids so fondly speak of the times when you and Ballebak came to visit. Mohsen, I couldn't have been happier with you as a PhD student. Compliments on what you've achieved today. Also, congratulations to your wife and your friends. And unfortunately, your parents couldn't be here today, but extend my congratulations to them as well. Thank you for the past 4 years, and congratulations. I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bram, for this wonderful speech. I would like to also congratulate you, of course, in my double role here as rector, as supervisor, but then also on behalf of the Council of Deans. It truly was a pleasure working with you. You're now leaving academia, which is definitely a loss. But then you go to TomTom, and of all the companies that I can imagine, this is, of course, kind of the double best that you can think of. I would also like to congratulate your wife on this wonderful day. I wish you all the best for the rest of your career and hope to see you many, many more times again. Thank you very much. I would now like to ask you to stand up, and I'll say a final prayer. Gratias tibi agimus, omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vives et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.